Hi, I'm Kerin, and this is Intarsia. Now, Intarsia is kind of a dirty word when it comes to knitting because you look at it and think, well, how on earth am I supposed to get all those colors in all those places when I'm knitting back and forth on a row? I mean, that doesn't make any sense, right? Actually, it does. Intarsia is basically a technique of colorwork knitting where you use more than one strand of yarn in a row. Now, sure, Fair Isle does the same thing, but this particular swatch here use I think 5 or 6 strands of yarn in a row. This probably uses up to 20 different strands of yarn in a row. And how on earth do you manage all of that? With Fair Isle it makes sense because you strand everything behind your work and you don't have to worry about it. With Intarsia, the method is a little bit different. So what I want to do is just kind of go over a few of the techniques for basic Intarsia just to kind of get your feet wet, because once you learn how to do Intarsia, it's a little bit addictive. You can put a picture in the middle of a sweater. You can put, like, you know, the little adorable characters on a kid's garment. You can do fantastic blankets like the nautical blanket, and you get these amazing pictures in your knitting. So now another thing that's different with Fair Isle and Intarsia is that Fair Isle can be knit flat or in the round. Intarsia has to be knit flat. Now, people will tell you, no, you can knit Intarsia in the round, but it's not truly in the round. And what I mean by that is that you are going forward, wrapping your yarn, and going back the other way. So you actually make something that's round, but you're not technically knitting in the round because you're knitting on the knit side and then the purl side. So it's a little bit different. So for things that are done in the round, usually they're knit flat and then seamed, or they're knit round to the point where you start Intarsia, and then you break the round, knit flat for a little while, and then join it back in the round, seam up where you have the Intarsia panel. And that's how you can get, you know, a sports logo on the front of a hat or on a sock. You know, things like that are really great for sports apparel, and, you know, if you just want to have one motif in one spot on, you know, one garment, it's a lot easier to knit a whole sweater, break the round for a couple of rounds, and then join it back together again. So basic Intarsia, which, you know, I'll show you in a little swatch here, just requires that wherever you have a change of color, you just wrap the yarns around each other. And there's a few different metrics that tell you, well, if you've got an angle that's like this, you have to wrap it so many rows. I just say wrap your yarn around each other every row, because you can't really go wrong doing that. And even if you're wrapping too much, it's better than not wrapping enough and getting holes. So the back of Intarsia looks a little funny. You basically have a whole bunch of little spots of color that have like dotted lines around them. And that's the wraps. That's where the 2 strands of yarn are actually wrapped around each other when you're knitting across. And the easiest way to remember how to wrap is just whatever color you're about to change to, bring it under the yarn that you just finished with. And that's all you have to do. So when you're knitting Intarsia, you have to manage your yarn somehow. You're going to have probably more than 2 colors in a row, and especially in cases where you have something like this square here, every section of color actually has to be a separate ball of yarn. So when you're getting to this red square, this is actually 1 ball of blue, 1 ball of white, 1 ball of red, another ball of white, another ball of blue. So you've got 5 separate balls of yarn working there. Now you could strand your white across the back, and in some cases, like in picture knitting, you do want to do that because it's going to save you a lot of trouble. But in this case, it's going to add a lot of bulk if you do that. So you'd want to have separate balls of yarn. So you have to manage all of these little balls of yarn hanging off the back of your work. So a good way to do that is, before you're going to start an Intarsia project, look at the chart, because it'll always provide you with a chart, and count the maximum number of colors in any given row, and make sure that you have that many bobbins available to you. And it could be something like this. We sell these lovely little yarn bobbins, and they just sort of open like that. You wrap your yarn around, close the top, and your yarn just hangs out there. And this is a size small. They come in medium and large as well. Another idea, and I really like this is just like a little hang tag. We use these for marking all sorts of things, our projects and things like that. You can get them at the office store, or you could even just use cardboard. You just kind of cut little holes out, wrap your yarn around, cut a slit in one end, and that'll actually hold your yarn. And what's great about this is, especially in cases with, if you're doing picture knitting or something where your colors are very close together, you can just write the color name right on the card. And that way, when you've got 20 little things hanging off the back, and 2 of those colors are so darn close, you know that it's this pink and not that pink, or something like that. So that's another idea. And then one of the most popular ones is just a little yarn butterfly. Now, I do like these when you're doing extremely small amounts of yarn. The only trouble is they do tend to unravel. So if you're staying put with your Intarsia, which is usually recommended, then it's fine to do yarn butterflies. Otherwise, if you're traveling, I would definitely recommend using the bobbins. Another great thing about them too is not only do they close, but they'll stack together. So if you're packing up your project to go on a trip or something, you can actually just click them together and have them all stuck to each other on the back of your work, and then just throw it in a bag and nothing's going to unravel. So I'm ready to start a row here. And as you can see, this is just a completely random swatch. It's a really fun thing to do, actually, if you're learning Intarsia. Just cast on a few colors and kind of make a mess of it. And by casting on a few colors, you really just, I cast on, I think, 10 stitches of one color, and immediately after that cast on a few stitches of another. And you don't have to join them together. They're joined together on the first row of actual knitting, and that's really it. From there, you just wrap the yarns around each other and they create this shape. So when you're knitting with the Intarsia technique, you just knit across in the first color, whatever color you happen to be using. And in this case, I'll keep my little pattern from the row previous, even though I was just kind of moving colors around randomly. And then what you'll want to do is take your next yarn, pull it from underneath that one, and what happens is they wrap in the back. And so these two are connected. They will not come apart from each other. So the green section will not separate from the brown section. And then you just knit across in that color. And it really is just that easy. It's the same way on the purl side. You just bring the yarn that you're going to be using next, which is to the left, under and over the yarn you just finished with, and you just sort of toss them over each other, pull them tight in the back, and that's all you do. When you're purling in Intarsia, it does get a little bit difficult, because especially if you are doing picture knitting, or if you have a lot of ends, it's kind of hard to see where you are in the pattern. So using something like a chart keeper or a highlighter is a really, really good idea, because that way you can tell where you are in the pattern. And for instance, this is a little chunk of picture knitting. This is just a gauge swatch, so it's nothing special. But I left I wove in some of the ends, but I left some of them loose, so you can kind of get an idea of what it starts to look like. There's just a ton of junk hanging off of there. And so when you're looking at all of these little floats in the back, this is actually, because it is picture knitting, it's stranded and Intarsia at the same time, which that's a conversation for a later time. You'll get tons of little bits hanging off. So you just want to be able to count really carefully, follow your chart, and turn it around a lot to make sure that you're on the right spot. And because there's usually a lot of colors involved, you can kind of look at what the row below looks like and what you're going to be knitting into. And if you know you're going to be knitting a black stitch over a green stitch, make sure you're doing them along the back. Or learn to knit backwards, but that also is a technique for another video. Knitting backwards is probably, I'd say if you're doing entrelac or Intarsia a lot, it's a really good thing to know how to do. But at any rate, Intarsia is really, really easy. It's really not that daunting. Once you actually pick it up and start to do it, you'll see that really it's all in the wrapping, and everything else, it's easy after that. So if you're new to Intarsia, what I would suggest you do is just get a piece of graph paper and just draw something on it. Draw a square or a star or a circle or something, 2 different colors, and then just cast on and try to make it work. Make sure you wrap your yarns around each other every time you change a color. Make sure that within each row, every time you see a separate spot of color, that's a different ball of yarn, so that you're not working with like in this case, one ball of blue that's hanging out behind all of white. And you'll really get used to it pretty quickly. And you'll find that, as long as you're using like different colors of the exact same yarn, your gauge won't change. You might get a little bit of a ripple where you actually change yarns, and that will actually come out during blocking, so you really won't see that very much. But you just kind of get the feel of it. Even a swatch like this, where it's basically just a few balls of yarn and every single row, every spot of color moves over one stitch. And then they're all wrapped around each other in the back. Something like this, about this size, by the time you're done with it, pretty much you're an expert in Intarsia, because the way that feels is exactly the way every other piece of Intarsia will feel. It's just you're moving things in different directions, you have more or less colors, you have different shapes, things like that. So essentially the technique of Intarsia is incredibly simple. It's just a method of picture knitting, essentially putting different colors together in a piece of knitting in a different way than stranding. So you don't have to bring the yarn around the whole thing. You can use 1 yard of a color and actually get a whole spot of color in your work. And it can be as simple as you like, something like this, as difficult as you like, picture knitting like this. But either way, it is a very, very simple technique, and I do recommend you try it.